the morning my husband Glen realized. My company had won the contract he'd been chasing for 8 months. He went very still in a way I'd never seen before. Not angry, not loud, just hollowed out, sitting across a boardroom table in downtown Calgary, with his hands folded and his eyes fixed somewhere slightly past my shoulder, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to look at me directly. And in that moment, after 32 years of marriage, after decades of laughing at the idea of me running anything more serious than a household calendar, my husband looked genuinely afraid of me. I want to tell you how that felt. I will. But first you need to understand where we started. Glen Mackenzie and I got married in the summer of 1991. When Calgary was still recovering from the oil crash of the 80s, and everyone was cautiously hopeful again. We rented a bungalow in the northwest with peeling window frames and a furnace that clanked so hard on cold nights it woke us both up. Glen had a borrowed pickup truck, a contractor's license, and the kind of confidence that made everyone around him feel like he already knew exactly where he was going. I believed in him completely. That was never the problem. Glen started Mackenzie Development Group from scratch, building out small condo units and commercial renovations across Calgary. What people saw when they looked at my husband was a man who'd built something real. Broad shoulders, big handshake, the kind of presence that made rooms tilt toward him without his having to try. What people didn't see was everything underneath that performance. The books were a disaster from the beginning. Glen had vision and he had energy, but contracts confused him. Cash flow projections terrified him, and he had a habit of agreeing to timelines that were technically impossible before calling me from a job site at 9 p.m, asking me to figure it out. I'd been working part-time as a bookkeeper before we had children, so I knew enough to be dangerous. Enough, it turned out, to quietly save the company more times than I can easily count. After our daughter Claire was born and our son Ryan 2 years later, I stepped back from paid work. But I never stepped back from Glen's business. I answered supplier emails during nap times. I reconciled bank statements at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed. When a major project nearly collapsed in 2003 because of overlapping subcontractor schedules nobody had caught, I rebuilt the timeline over a weekend while Glen played golf in Banff with clients. He came back to a solved problem and took the client to dinner to celebrate his sharp management instincts. At those dinners, I was introduced as his wife. "Pearl keeps the home fires burning," Glen would say with a good-natured laugh, and everyone would nod pleasantly and move on. I kept smiling. That was what you did. That was what I told myself partnership looked like. Ryan grew up watching his father the way young men watch fathers they want to become. Loud, decisive, someone people listen to instantly. By the time Ryan was in university, he was already talking about joining Mackenzie Development Group one day, absorbing Glen's version of how the company had been built, a version in which I barely existed. Our daughter Claire was different. Claire watched things quietly. She noticed when I slipped out of conversations that should have included me. She noticed the exhaustion I carried home from client dinners where I'd spent 3 hours managing logistics nobody acknowledged. She noticed, and she was gentle about it, which sometimes made it worse. By the time I turned 61, something had shifted inside me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Glen's company had grown considerably. A small office in Mission, a staff of 12, contracts across southern Alberta. And my world had somehow become smaller while his expanded. I'd stopped pushing opinions in conversations where I knew the subject better than anyone at the table. I'd learned to agree quickly, to avoid the longer discomfort of being talked over. One evening in late October, the 4 of us had dinner at the house. Glen sat at the head of the table, half watching his phone. Ryan was talking about a renovation project he'd been advising on. Claire was helping me carry dishes in from the kitchen. I'd been turning the idea over in my mind for months. I hadn't told anyone. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I heard my own voice say it. "I've been thinking about starting a property management consulting company for smaller condo developers and independent landlords. There's a real gap in the market for operational support." The table went quiet. Glen looked up from his phone slowly, the way you do when something registers as slightly absurd. Ryan blinked. Claire put down the dish she was holding. "You're serious," Glen said. "Yes." Glen leaned back in his chair and laughed. Not a small laugh. A full, warm, room-filling laugh that was worse than mockery because it sounded so genuinely surprised. "Pearl," he said, shaking his head, "you've never managed a client relationship in your life." I kept my voice level. "I've managed dozens of your client relationships." "That's different. That's helping me. He waved a hand. "That's not the same thing as running a business." Ryan smiled carefully, the way young men do when they're trying to stay neutral, but are already sided. "It's a tough market, Mum. Development consulting is competitive." "I know. And you'd be starting from scratch, at your age." That phrase, "at your age." I looked at my son and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have sounded like the beginning of an argument I wasn't ready to have. Glen reached across and patted my hand with the cheerful affection of someone dismissing a child's question. "You'd be brilliant at a book club," he said. "Honestly, you'd run the best book club in Calgary." Ryan laughed under his breath. Claire looked at me, just looked at me, steady and still, and didn't laugh at all. Later that night, after Glen had fallen asleep watching the news and the house had gone quiet, I sat at the desk in the small back bedroom we used for storage and opened my laptop. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from something older. The particular physical sensation of crossing a line you can't uncross. I registered the business name before I could talk myself out of it. Pearl Mackenzie Consulting. A sole proprietorship. Property management advisory services for small-scale residential developers and independent landlords. Glen was still laughing at something on the television downstairs. I clicked confirm. The first 3 months were genuinely humbling. I sent introduction emails that went unanswered for weeks. I attended a networking breakfast at a hotel in Kensington where I knew nobody and stood near the fruit table for 20 minutes pretending to be busy on my phone. I built a website that received, according to the analytics tool I'd downloaded, in a moment of optimism, 7 visitors in its first month. 4 of those were me. Every morning after Glen left for the office, I sat at that desk with my coffee and kept going. I was 61 years old and I was beginning to understand something. Nobody tells you about starting over late. Rejection feels different when you're older. It doesn't just sting. It confirms every quiet fear you've been carrying for years. Then about 6 weeks in, my phone rang. Her name was Brenda Nakamura. She owned 3 rental properties in Inglewood and had recently purchased a small 4-unit building she was entirely unprepared to manage. She'd gotten my name from someone at a property information session I'd attended in September. A session at which I'd apparently asked the only genuinely useful questions of the evening. "I've been trying to sort out my expense tracking for 8 months, Brenda told me, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been drowning slowly. "My accountant is frustrated with me. I don't blame her." "I've seen that situation before," I told her. "Can I take a look?" When Brenda arrived at my kitchen table 2 days later with a canvas tote bag full of receipts, papers, invoices, and 3 separate notebooks in which she'd been attempting a manual ledger system, I felt something unlock in me that I hadn't realized was closed. Within an hour, I found the core problem. She'd been categorizing repair expenses against the wrong properties, which was affecting her tax position significantly. She'd also set her rent review schedule against the wrong provincial regulations and had been leaving money on the table for 2 years. "Nobody's ever explained it this clearly to me," Brenda said. I smiled. I've had a long time to practice explaining things nobody was asking me to explain. Brenda referred me to 3 other landlords by Christmas. By spring, I had 8 clients, a shared office space near 17th Avenue, and a revenue figure that Glen, when he found out the number, went quiet about for a full week. He never quite found his way back to calling it a book club after that. But something else was happening at the same time. Something I didn't want to look at directly. One afternoon in February, I was going through old tax files in the storage room. Glen had asked me to find documentation related to a 2016 equipment loan for his accountant, and I found a mortgage guarantee agreement from 2018. My name was on it as a co-signatory. I didn't remember signing it. I looked at the signature carefully. It looked like mine. Almost. The capital P was narrower than I made it. The loop on the Y in Mackenzie moved the wrong direction. I sat on the floor of that storage room for a long time. I found 3 more documents over the following week. Some signatures were clearly mine. Others I couldn't say for certain. And the uncertainty itself was the worst part. Because when you've spent 30 years deferring, you genuinely begin to wonder whether your own memory is reliable or whether you've simply forgotten agreeing to things you were rushed through. When I mentioned it to Glen, he sighed deeply and told me I was imagining things. Then he said, with the calm certainty of a man who has never been questioned in his own home, "You've signed hundreds of documents over the years, Pearl. You just don't remember." That tone, patient, slightly tired, as if my concern was a mild inconvenience he was generously absorbing. I had heard 1,000 times. I didn't argue. I started making copies instead. Claire noticed the change in me immediately. She stopped by one Saturday morning, and the second she looked at my face, she said, "What happened?" I showed her the documents. She read through them slowly, and when she looked up, her expression was very careful. "Have you spoken to anyone? Legally, I mean?" "Not yet." "Mum," she put her hand over mine, "you need to protect yourself." I kept that sentence with me for days. Protect yourself. Not the marriage, not Glen, not the version of the family I'd been holding together for 30 years. Myself. By the following autumn, my company had grown beyond what I'd imagined possible when I registered it on that quiet October night. I had 12 regular clients, 2 part-time contractors, and a partnership inquiry from a commercial property firm in Edmonton that would have meant more revenue in a single year than Glen's company had generated in its third. Isabelle Fontaine reached me through that inquiry. She was one of the most respected property development executives in Western Canada. Her firm, Fontaine Pacific Properties, handled large-scale mixed-use projects across Alberta and British Columbia. We met for lunch at a restaurant overlooking the Bow River, and within the first 15 minutes, Isabelle had said more substantive things about my work than Glen had said in 32 years of marriage. "You understand operational risk from the ground up, not from a boardroom down," she said. "That's rare. I've had a lot of experience managing problems before they became emergencies," I told her. "I know." Isabelle looked at me with the directness of someone who didn't have time to be otherwise. "I've spoken with 4 of your clients. They all say the same thing. You make them feel capable instead of stupid." She paused. "How much of your husband's company did you actually run?" I wasn't sure how to answer. "A significant amount," I finally said, without the title. Isabelle nodded once, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she slid a folder across the table. A consortium of developers was launching a major new condominium project in Edmonton, the largest affordable residential development in the province in a decade. They needed an operational management partner to coordinate between contractors, financiers, and municipal planning. The contract was substantial enough to permanently change the shape of my company, and Mackenzie Development Group had already submitted a bid. Glen found out about my bid before the decision was made. He came home one evening and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd laughed at the idea of me running a business, and for the first time I saw something in his face I'd never seen there before. Not anger. Fear. "Pearl," he said carefully, "this isn't the kind of project you walk away from unscathed if it goes wrong. I know that. These developers are serious people. They're not going to be patient." I poured 2 cups of tea and sat down across from him. "Glen, I've been managing operational risk in development projects for most of my adult life. I just wasn't allowed to put my name on any of them." He went quiet. I continued softly. "I think you know that's true. Ryan came by the following week and told me I was being unfair to his father. That competition within a marriage was destructive, that I hadn't thought through what winning might cost our family. I asked him, as gently as I could, whether he remembered the evening 3 years ago when Glen had been in a panic over the Saddleback project, the subcontractor scheduling disaster that nearly cost him a major client. Ryan said he remembered. I asked him who had rebuilt the timeline that weekend. He thought about it. He said he'd assumed Glen had handled it. Your father was in Banff, I said quietly. Ryan didn't say anything for a moment then. You did it? I did. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked, in that moment, younger than I'd seen him look in years. Mum, You don't have to say anything now, I told him. I know you love your father. I'm not asking you to stop. The final selection meeting was held in Edmonton on a Thursday in November, gray and cold, the kind of Alberta winter day that feels like the sky has simply decided to press down on everything. I sat in a glass-walled boardroom on the 14th floor with my proposal binder and answered every question the panel asked clearly, and without performing confidence I didn't feel. I've never been the loudest person in a room. I've never needed to be. Across the table, Glen sat with his team. He was polished and present, the way he always was in rooms like that. But something was off in the rhythm of his answers, a slight hesitation on the financial questions, a small uncertainty when the panel asked about operational contingency planning. I recognized what I was seeing because I had covered those gaps for him, quietly, for 3 decades. The panel chair called me 2 days later. Pearl Mackenzie Consulting was awarded primary operational authority over the Edmonton Consortium project, effective the 1st of January. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call ended. The city outside the window looked ordinary and bright. Life continued, cheerfully indifferent to the size of what had just changed. Glen called that evening. His voice was flat in a way I'd never heard before. Congratulations, he said. I thanked him quietly. I heard the panel said you were the calmest person in the room. There was something complicated in his voice when he said it, pride and grief, mixed in a proportion I couldn't quite name. I've had a lot of practice staying calm in rooms where I wasn't sure I was supposed to be there, I told him. He didn't answer that. The hardest part wasn't winning. The hardest part came 3 weeks later, when the lawyers confirmed that several of the personal guarantee signatures on Glen's debt restructuring documents were inconsistent with my established signing pattern. The investigation that followed was quiet and careful, and ultimately confirmed what I'd suspected since that afternoon on the storage room floor. Glen had signed my name, not once, not in one desperate moment, but repeatedly, over years, assuming I would never look closely enough to notice. He believed that, right up until I did. Ryan came to my office one evening in December, unannounced. He stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees from Tim Hortons, a peace offering so Canadian it almost made me smile, and looked at me with the eyes of a man who had been doing some long overdue mathematics. I'm sorry, he said. No qualifications. I know. I didn't let myself see what was in front of me. His voice broke slightly on the last word. You were taught not to, I said. That doesn't make it entirely your fault, but it's yours to carry now. He nodded, looking at the floor. I reached across and squeezed his hand, the way I had when he was 8 years old and had done something he knew was wrong and couldn't find the words for it. Glen and I separated in the spring. The legal matters were complicated and took longer than I would have liked, but they resolved, and I came out of them protected in ways I would not have been if I'd stayed quiet. Some evenings I still feel grief about the marriage we had in those early years, before success made Glen a person I no longer fully recognized. That grief is real. It doesn't contradict anything else that's true. Claire joined my company the following year. She's sharp and funny and notices things immediately, the way she always has. On her first day, she looked around the office and said, very quietly, I always knew you had this in you. I told her I wasn't sure. I'd always known that myself. She thought about it for a moment. I know, she said. That's the part that breaks my heart a little. It's a strange thing, being seen clearly by someone who loves you. It unmakes you slightly, in a way that turns out to be necessary. I think about that often. About all the women who are keeping something together right now with their hands and their memory and their steadiness inside businesses and households and families, without a title or a credit or a single moment where someone in a room says their name and the room pays attention. I want them to know it is not too late. It was never too late. And the version of you that you've been quietly keeping alive underneath all those years of being useful, she's been waiting. She knows exactly what to do.